with respect to the right to repair, you know, um, I will, as a Rossman follower, I do know that, the pieces of legislation that come down are not always ideal. They often come out with problems, like they still ultimately allow for the fuckery that makes it very difficult to do, truly economical repairs. Now, I'll get, I don't disagree or dissent from this concern and vantage point, but I wanted to ultimately say that, when I look at things and the reality of lobbying and political donations, when I look out there, I see a landscape where the corporate powers, right, that be and that exist give far more money on average to the Republican Party than to the Democrats. And this has created a situation where if I want something that doesn't necessarily serve the interest of the corporations, like I'm sure Apple would rather you not fix your stuff. They would rather you, ultimately have to throw it out and buy a new one, because that maximizes their returns during the process. But of course, if they can sell you one that's more expensive than the new one, then, a repair that's more expensive than the new one, that's even better for them. But, the reality is that they want to sell you a brand new device on top of, the one that you had, just to have you throw the old one out, buy a new one, and have that disposable culture, because that makes them the most money in the process. And so that's what they prefer. Now, if I want an agenda that makes it, easier to, not have to buy a whole assembly of a part, but just the part that broke, the individual component of it, to put that new one in and everything, and they can't parts pair and play all the fucking games that they've been playing to drive up the cost of repairs. Now if I ultimately am, able to do that, and to to anyways, but to rewind a little bit, the political process. If I want something that Apple doesn't want, if I want a policy that the companies are not going to like, that they're going to send a bunch of lobbyists in to the chamber to try to scaremonger our politicians from passing, and lie to them, and sell whatever sort of hooliganry or bullshit that they want to push through the political process as lobbyist and everything, then you should know that the corporate powers have given far less money to the Democratic Party, which means that the Democratic Party is far less likely to be in lockstep with what the business community wants. The Chamber of Commerce types that want to do whatever it takes for companies to make as much fucking money as possible, so that they won't even do repairs, even if it starts filling up the landfills and the e-waste problem absolutely explodes and everything. Like, do you get what I'm trying to say? Your better bet is always going to be with the party that the lobbyists have given less money to. Nothing is ever black and white. Otherwise, the right to repair pieces of legislation never would have gotten through at all, even as the ones that we have that have the holes in them and the problems with these pieces of legislation. It's better than nothing, and everything. And, they've... So my ultimate point in all of this is that not all politicians are the same. That, on top of that, that the fucking corporations, that want, the fucking Great Reset, you'll own nothing and be happy. They would rather the Republicans win elections. They give far more money to that party, and that party acts in their interest far more readily than it does the little guy like you or me and everything. Now, there may be a perception that the constituency of the Democratic Party tends to be a little bit more affluent inside of our society, and the limousine liberals and everything, and that phenomenon of elites. But, the reality at the end of the day is that, the GOP had for many, many decades been the party of big business. And, despite the fact that they have, begun to feud with Disney down there and all the fuckery that's been going on and down in Florida with, the governor and everything towards Disney and everything, that actually made me like a Disney hater, actually, end up siding with them about in the dispute because, like the governor was just such a rat ass bastard that it was like, okay, I'll put down my disputes with Disney for the moment because, they don't deserve this and everything. And, but the thing is that if you want a policy like the right to repair that, is going to grind up against corporations that would make a lot more money, in the process, if these pieces of legislation didn't pass and companies that don't want you repairing their items because it's far better for them if you throw it out and buy another one from them, those guys are like, those policies are going to sail a lot more readily through the Democratic Party than they are the Republican one, because again, they have not buttered the toast of the Democratic Party anywhere near the same extent as they have the wined and dined and everything else to anywhere near the extent that they have the Republican Party. It's just not equal. And that's why, you're seeing right to repair sail through much more easily and much more comprehensive packages coming out of blue states. So, it's just so you are able to fully comprehend what I'm saying. The whole idea of you'll own nothing and buy, you'll own nothing and be happy concept, that's a Republican concept. It's not a Democratic one. They're the ones that own that shit. They're the ones that are building that world every day with their fucking policies. Open your eyes, man. I don't know how the Republican Party got twisted into being the party of the little guy. It doesn't make sense. They certainly don't pass policies that are in his interest. But of course, unfortunately, many members of the working class, the problem with them is that they're so afraid. The way that they look at it, I do better if I've got all the rights that in the world. I don't care ultimately about shit like firearm rights and abortion. Go ahead. Have abortions on demand be the fucking policy and no guns. I don't give a shit. If I don't have the right to own one, doesn't mean fucking shit to me. Just make me richer, fundamentally. And that's the only thing I fucking care about, as far as how I'm going to allocate my vote. And I'm going to vote in the best interest of everybody around me, too, because the Democrats, when they're in power, often pass policies that are in the collective interest. They do a lot better. Everybody does better. The stock market does better. The rich do better. The poor do better. The broad middle of America does better. The idea there's this idea out there that the Republicans are somehow better for the economy, but the truth of the matter is that when Democrats win, the stock market rallies every fucking time. There's no crash as a result of it. People act like if the left wins, there's going to be this stock market catastrophe that happens and everything. But, it's no surprise to me that the right to repair sailed through Oregon as a state, because the fucking government is a Democrat. It's a fucking blue state where the Democrats have almost a complete trifecta in terms of power. We have pretty much super majorities in this state, so of course the right to repair passed through here. The Democratic Party is nowhere near as bought as the Republican one in reality. And while they are both bought, the fact is that there are material differences that are, almost like they are measurable. There is a big difference between what happens when somebody wants a piece of legislation that isn't, completely beholden to the corporate interest, that doesn't align entirely with the corporate bottom line. And the thing about the right to repair is that it really doesn't, it's messy. There are a lot of really big and powerful companies that would rather you not be able to fix their stuff. They would make more, and they're going to lobby aggressively to prevent, the right to repair from getting through.